Take a slow breath and feel the quiet settle, and let the edges of the world begin to blur. The clatter of the day, the rhythm of thoughts, the echoes of every small concern. They drift away piece by piece, like leaves carried off by a slow river. The mind softens, the breath deepens, the heart quiets to the pace of the stars. And in that calm, when even the present seems to pause, something ancient begins to awaken. You can almost hear it if you listen, not loud, not sudden, but gentle as silk sliding over stone. It is the sound of history breathing in its sleep. The soft turning of centuries, the creak of forgotten doors, the whisper of parchment touched by candlelight. Time does not vanish, it only rests, waiting for someone, perhaps you, to remember. Tonight it stirs again, rising like mist from the corners of the world. Picture a candle burning in a stone chamber. The flame trembles uncertain, and the shadows on the wall dance like old memories. Each flicker opens a doorway, a gate to a jousting field where armor glints beneath a dying sun, a narrow cloister where a monk kneels before a cracked mirror, a garden perfumed with roses and secrets behind palace walls, a road stretching eastward where a lone traveler watches the horizon turn gold. The light wavers and the centuries shift. The air hums with the voices of those who once were, speaking softly through the fabric of time. The world, too, loves its bedtime stories. It murmurs to itself in dreams of the past, of laughter that ended too soon, of pride that turned to sorrow, of wisdom born quietly in the ruins of mistakes. Once a king's arrogance ended an age of sport. Once a monk's vanity taught the cost of reflection. Once a jester's words silenced laughter for generations, and yet, beneath those follies, something tender always remained, a pulse of understanding, faint but enduring. There was also a place where women stood unafraid, their voices sharp as reason and calm as morning rain. Sparta, the city of discipline and pride, where mothers sent their sons to war, not with tears, but with truth. Far away, in another empire wrapped in silk and secrecy, women ruled behind veils, not by decree or sword, but by intelligence, by composure, by patience that outlasted kings. And then, beyond all borders, a boy from Venice listened to stories of faraway lands and let them shape his dreams. He crossed deserts, mountains, and oceans until his footsteps became a bridge between worlds. His name would echo across centuries, not for what he conquered, but for what he saw and for how deeply he learned to listen. These are not merely stories of what has been. They are small mirrors in which we glimpse ourselves, our pride, our longing, our mistakes, our grace. History is not distant. It lives quietly within every heartbeat. Each tale is a breath, a sigh from the ages, reminding us that to live is to learn, and to learn is to love the fragile beauty of being human. So now, breathe slowly. Feel the night settling around you like a cloak. The candle burns steady. Its light flickers over the words you are about to follow. Words that will drift like snow through the corridors of time, soft, patient, and full of wonder. Let the centuries unfold gently before you. The past is waiting, not as a lesson, but as a lullaby. And as the flame bends and sways, time opens its pages. Our journey begins, through laughter and loss, through silence and song, into the long, peaceful dream of history. Medieval things ruined by one person. In the fading light of a summer afternoon, King Henry II of France rode into the lists, armor glinting like melted gold. The air smelled of dust and roses, banners fluttered softly, and a hush settled over the crowd. Everyone knew the king was brave, perhaps too brave. His advisors had pleaded with him to rest, to honor the omens and the prophecies that whispered of danger. But Henry, restless and proud, believed that honor lived only in the next charge forward. The two riders lowered their lances and spurred ahead. For a moment, the world was nothing but the thunder of hooves and the shimmer of steel. Then a splinter broke loose, a thin arc of wood, swift and silent as a bird in flight. It found its way beneath the visor. When the crowd cheered, they did not yet know the king was still. Hours later, the palace grew quiet, and the sound of tournaments was stilled forever. France banned the sport soon after. The fields where knights once rode grew over with clover and silence. Yet in that silence lingered a lesson that courage and pride, though born of the same fire, burn at different heats. One illuminates, the other consumes. Tonight, as you listen, imagine the empty arena under the moonlight, the helmets resting on wooden posts, the wind moving softly through forgotten banners. No crowds, no cheers, only the echo of hoofbeats fading into the distance. The story ends not in tragedy, but in stillness, a gentle reminder that even kings must learn to lay down their armor and rest. In a quiet monastery nestled between the hills, Brother Pierre was known for his calm spirit and careful hands. The halls were lined with the scent of wax and cedar, the air filled with a constant murmur of prayer. One evening, as dusk deepened into gold, Pierre lingered before a polished mirror, rare in such a humble place. He touched the edge of the frame, curious about the face that looked back. The candles flickered, a breath of wind slipped through the window, and the small lamp beside him trembled. In a heartbeat, glass cracked, flame met oil, and light turned to fire. The corridor glowed with sudden brightness, then smoke. The brothers ran with buckets and wet cloths, their chants mingling with the roar of burning wood. When morning came, half the hall was blackened, and the mirror lay in shards upon the floor. Pierre wept, not for the fire, but for the vanity that had guided his hand. The abbot, gentle and solemn, declared that mirrors would no longer hang within the walls. Not for fear of flame, he said softly, but for fear of forgetting who we truly are. From then on, the brothers shaved by touch and dressed by candlelight. As centuries passed, the story became a quiet legend, a reflection without glass. And if you listen now, you might still hear the slow footsteps of monks in the corridor, the soft scrape of a broom, the hush of forgiveness lingering in the air. Peace returned, and the monastery slept once more beneath the silver moon. Long ago, when mist lay soft upon the meadows of Kent, Lord Geoffrey rose before dawn, his boots damp with dew, and his breath pale in the chill air. He was a man of curious spirit, always seeking to do what others would not. That morning, instead of his falcon, he brought a creature no hunter had ever carried, a white owl, silent and solemn, its golden eyes calm as candlelight. The chaplain who rode beside him whispered a prayer, uneasy at the sight. But Geoffrey only smiled. "Let us see," he said, "if wisdom can hunt as well as fury." They rode into the clearing, the sky paling into rose. At a signal, the owl lifted into the air, wings moving without sound, ghost-like above the trees. For a heartbeat, it was beautiful, pure stillness in motion. Then, startled by the shimmer of the priest's silver cross, the owl dove, swift as a falling star. The chaplain cried out, the horses reared, and chaos scattered across the morning field. When calm returned, Geoffrey dismounted in silence, his pride cooling like embers. From that day on, the owl was never again brought to the hunt. It returned to its place among shadows and branches where its silence belonged. The lords of England learned a quiet truth, that not every gift of nature is meant for mastery, and not all stillness should be broken by human hands. And so, when night falls over Kent, the owls still call softly from the woods, keepers of a lesson whispered long ago beneath the moon. In the grand cathedral of Essex, the morning light filtered through stained glass, painting the marble floor in rivers of blue and gold. Sir Reginald of Essex stood among nobles and clergy, proud in his finery. His robes shimmered with thread of silver, and upon his feet were shoes of the newest fashion, curved to sharp points like the beaks of swans. Each step echoed softly through the hall, graceful, confident, and just a little vain. When the choir began to sing, Reginald stepped forward to kneel. The shoes, elegant but absurdly long, tangled beneath his robe. In a single breath, Grace turned to comedy. He stumbled, arms flailing, and fell against the wooden railing, sending a ripple of surprise through the solemn congregation. The priests gasped, the candles wavered, and laughter, quickly swallowed, moved like wind through the pews. Reginald rose, red-faced yet smiling faintly, but by evening the tale had travelled through every manor in the Shire. The pointed shoes that once symbolized status now whispered of foolish pride. The court soon declared them unbecoming of gentle virtue, and tailors began shaping new shoes, round, modest, and simple. In the seasons that followed, the fashion of humility took root. People walked a little surer, their steps quieter upon the stone. And though Sir Reginald's name faded with time, the story lingered, light as dust in sunlight, a reminder that elegance is not in the length of one's shoes, but in the steadiness of one's step. In the grey hush of midwinter, when snow lay like linen upon the roofs of the old cathedral town, the monks prepared for the Feast of Fools, a single day when laughter was permitted to echo through holy walls. Candles glowed softly against the stone, and the cold air smelled of wax and bread. Among the brothers was Roland, young and quick of heart, who believed that joy could be another way of praising God. He crafted a robe from crimson fabric, trimmed it with ribbons, and set upon his head a paper crown. With a playful bow, he stood before the altar, blessing the others in jest. The choir laughed, even the abbot smiled, for a brief moment forgetting the weight of solemn days. Laughter rolled like music through the chapel, gentle, harmless, warm. But as dusk fell, the laughter spilled beyond the walls, mingling with wine and song until reverence dissolved into noise. The next morning, the bishop's decree arrived. The Feast of Fools would be no more. The bells rang, not for joy, but for silence restored. Years later, the story of Brother Roland lingered like a soft hymn. Some said he had not mocked holiness, but reminded it of its heart. And when the wind moves through the cloisters at night, the brothers still imagine a smile in its whisper, light, fleeting, and kind. So ends the Feast of Fools, a tender echo of laughter that dared, for one brief day, to live beside prayer. In the golden glow of the royal hall, laughter once flowed as freely as the wine. King Henry I sat upon his throne, draped in velvet, surrounded by courtiers who lived by smiles and silence. Among them was Roland le Fool, the jester, bright-eyed, nimble, and trusted to speak where others could not. His bells jingled softly as he danced, and his words, though sharp, were meant only to lift the weight of crowns. One evening, beneath chandeliers that shimmered like frozen stars, Le Fool's tongue slipped faster than wisdom. With an innocent grin, he jested about the king's thinning hair, comparing the royal crown to sunlight upon a polished hill. The court froze. The laughter that usually followed his wit faltered into breathless stillness. For the briefest moment, even the torches seemed to dim. King Henry smiled, thinly, politely, and dismissed the gathering. The next morning, a decree was read across the kingdom. No man, no woman, no fool would henceforth speak jest of the royal family. Humour, once a gentle servant of the throne, was cast into exile. Le Fool's laughter faded from the palace halls. Yet sometimes, late at night, when the courtiers walked the echoing corridors, they swore they could still hear the faint chime of bells, soft, distant, forgiving. The echo carried not mockery, but memory, that even kings wrapped in gold and power once needed laughter to keep their hearts from turning to stone. And so, the silence that followed became its own kind of joke, one the kingdom would never laugh at again. The year was fading toward winter, and the field outside Paris lay veiled in mist. Two knights faced one another across the frost-dusted ground, Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris, each armoured in faith as much as in steel. The crowd gathered in silence, believing that heaven itself would choose the victor. It was called a trial by combat, the ancient judgment of God. When the horns sounded, they charged. The clash of iron broke the still air, echoing through the cold morning. Spears splintered, shields cracked, and the watching crowd prayed under their breath. To them, justice was not decided by reason or evidence, but by divine will made visible in battle. Yet as the fight stretched on, sweat and blood blurred faith with exhaustion. The sky remained unmoved, the clouds without sign. At last, one knight fell, and the other stood trembling in triumph. The crowd roared, but somewhere among them a priest lowered his head, whispering that perhaps God did not take sides so easily. In that whisper began the end of an era. When the field emptied, only silence remained, a soft wind moving through torn banners. The king decreed that no more men would seek judgment by the sword. Justice, he said, must learn to listen instead of strike. And so the age of faith gave way to the age of thought. The grass grew back over the scarred ground, and on quiet nights the earth still seems to sigh, a reminder that truth, like peace, is best won without a blade. In the gentle twilight of Burgundy, steam once rose from marble pools where candles flickered and laughter echoed like ripples on water. Lord Alaric, a noble fond of grandeur, decided that bathing should be a celebration, not a solitude. One spring evening, he invited courtiers, musicians, and poets to share the warm baths of his manor. Perfume drifted through the air, petals floated on the surface, and soft music wound through the corridors like silk. At first, it was innocent delight, friends speaking softly, voices mingling with the splash of calm water. But as the night deepened, the music grew louder, the laughter brighter, and the fine line between joy and indulgence blurred into mist. Servants whispered, priests frowned, and the rumour travelled faster than the steam that rose above the garden walls. By dawn, the manor lay silent again, the pools still shimmering with dawn's reflection. But the story had already reached the Duke's court. Within days, a new decree was read aloud. Henceforth, men and women would bathe apart modestly and only in private. The laughter of that single night had redrawn the boundaries of propriety. Years passed, and the great bathhouse stood empty, its tiles cool beneath the moonlight. People bathed behind closed doors, their silence replacing the echoes of that forgotten feast. Even now, travellers say that on quiet evenings you can still smell rosewater on the wind near the ruins of Alaric's estate, a faint reminder that joy, too freely poured, can overflow its vessel and vanish into history's calm waters. In the winding lanes of old London, the scent of warm bread once floated each morning through the fog. Among the bakers who rose before dawn was Thomas of London, a man known for his steady hands, and some whispered a touch too much greed. Flour dusted his sleeves like snow as he shaped his loaves, but one winter, when grain was scarce and coin thin, he began to slip small stones into the dough, hoping the weight would pass unnoticed. For a time, it did. Customers carried home their bread, never suspecting. But one cold morning, a woman broke her loaf beside the hearth and found the lie within, a pebble shining faintly in the firelight. The news spread faster than smoke, and soon the townsfolk gathered before Thomas's shop, silent and disappointed rather than angry. The city magistrate arrived, his robes smelling faintly of ash, and spoke softly. "Trust," he said, "is the yeast that makes every trade rise." From that day, a new law took root. Bakers, to prove their honesty, would sell 13 loaves for every dozen ordered, one extra for goodwill, a 13th for forgiveness. It became known as the baker's dozen. Years later, when Thomas had grown grey and gentle, he would still place that extra loaf upon the counter with quiet care. The clink of coin and the scent of bread filled his shop once more, not as profit, but as peace. And outside, the fog of London carried the warmth of redemption, soft and slow as dawn. In a small stone abbey beside the River Seine, the evenings were filled with music, soft chants that drifted like smoke through the candlelight. Among the monks was Brother Antonius, gentle in voice and patient in heart, who loved the way sound could travel farther than words. One quiet night, as rain touched the windows, he lingered at the organ, humming a second note above the melody, a thread of harmony, tender and new. The sound rose, shimmering like water in moonlight. Other brothers paused, listening. It was as if two prayers, once separate, had found each other in the air and embraced. For a moment, the chapel breathed with life. The walls seemed to glow with unseen color. But when the abbot entered, the music fell silent. "One voice is humble," he said softly. "Two may lead the heart astray." And so the harmony was forbidden, the organ closed, and Antonius returned to his quiet duties. Still he hummed as he worked, his simple tune echoing faintly in the corridors. The others heard and remembered. Years later, when rules softened and the world began to hunger again for beauty, his hidden notes returned, woven into songs that would fill cathedrals across Europe. They say that if you stand beneath a vaulted ceiling and hear the voices rising in harmony, one is still his. It floats somewhere in the upper air, gentle, patient, eternal, reminding us that even silence cannot hold back the desire to sing. London, long before its skyline of stone and glass, was a city of timber and candlelight. Each night, 1,000 hearths glowed softly behind crooked windows, their smoke weaving into the fog. In one small bakery near the bridge, an apprentice named Geoffrey stayed awake past curfew, kneading dough by the dim light of an oil lamp. The air was heavy with warmth and flour, and the world beyond his door was hushed. As he reached for another log, his sleeve brushed the lamp. It tipped, spilling fire across the straw-strewn floor. The boy froze, then shouted, but the wind that swept through the open door carried the spark farther. Flames climbed the walls like hungry vines. By dawn, the street was a river of smoke, and London stood in mourning silence, its night turned to ashes. When the embers cooled, the city elders gathered in solemn quiet. They did not speak of punishment, but of prevention. A decree was written: from sunset to sunrise, no open flame would burn without watch. The city would learn to sleep in darkness, its safety guarded by caution rather than chance. Years passed and London rose again, stronger, wiser, gentler. The scent of new wood replaced the smoke, and Geoffrey, now an old man, would sometimes tell the tale to apprentices by daylight only, and as dusk fell over the Thames, the lamps were trimmed and shuttered, the city glowing not with fire, but with memory, soft, golden, and safe. It was a grey morning in Vienne, the sky heavy with the hush of morning. The townsfolk gathered before the cathedral gates to honour a fallen lord, a knight once beloved for his valour and his laughter. The air was thick with incense, and bells tolled slow and deep, each note folding into the next like waves of sorrow. Yet among the mourners stood Sir Aldrich de Vienne, a man who believed grief should be met with glory. When the ceremony ended, Aldrich lifted his helm and spoke to the crowd. "Let us honour the dead as he lived," he declared, with the clash of arms and the cry of courage. At first there was hesitation, then the ring of steel as knights mounted their horses. The field beside the graveyard filled with colour and motion, banners streaming, lances raised, hooves beating like drums against the silence of loss. But as the dust rose, so too did unease. The widow wept, the priests turned away, the laughter of combat, once a sound of pride, now echoed hollow beneath the shadow of death. By dusk, the church spoke its judgment. Never again would games or tournaments mar the stillness of farewell. Years later, the tale of that day softened into legend. No more lances shone beside graves, only candles, steady, unwavering, peaceful. And on quiet evenings, the people of Vienne still said that the wind through the chapel yard carried the ghost of hooves, not as a warning, but as a reminder that respect, like love, must sometimes be silent. In the heart of Burgundy, when the harvest was gathered and the wine casks were full, the townsfolk prepared a feast unlike any before. Tables stretched across the square beneath lanterns that swayed in the warm night air. Music floated from strings and flutes, mingling with laughter and the clatter of plates. For a while, the world felt kind and golden, as though peace itself had chosen to sit among them. At the head of the celebration sat Sir Baldwin, a nobleman of generous spirit and louder voice. As the evening deepened, toasts grew bolder, the music faster, and the air thick with joy that tipped toward carelessness. A single misunderstanding, a jest too sharp, a glance too proud, sparked a ripple across the crowd. Words turned to shouts, shouts to movement, and suddenly the harmony of the feast fractured into noise. Candles fell, wine spilled, and the music stumbled into silence. When morning came, the square lay quiet beneath the pale light. Broken cups and wilted flowers lined the streets like the remnants of a dream that had ended too soon. The council met, their hearts heavy, and declared that no feast so large would ever be held again. Celebration, they said, must find its place within calm and order. In the years that followed, smaller gatherings replaced the grand ones, families around hearths, friends beneath vine-draped porches. The music softened, the laughter gentled, and Burgundy learned that joy, when spoken softly, lasts far longer than the loudest cheer. In the ancient halls of the University of Rouen, where ink stained every fingertip and the scent of parchment filled the air, students once whispered of secret sciences, of metals that could breathe, of stones that could turn to gold. Among them was Etienne, a quiet scholar with eyes bright as flame and a heart eager to understand what the world kept hidden. Late one night, while the city slept under rain and lantern smoke, Etienne stayed behind in his study. On his desk sat a brass vessel, a drop of oil, and a single candle whose light trembled like thought itself. He mixed powders as he had read in forbidden notes, hoping to coax matter into miracle. But a knowledge, untamed, has its own will. The mixture hissed, shimmered, and bloomed into fire. Within moments, The shelves of scrolls were alight, the glass shattered, and the corridors filled with the sound of running feet and prayer. When dawn arrived, the fire was gone, leaving only soot and silence. Etienne was unharmed, but the library's heart had turned to ash. The rector, standing in the grey morning light, spoke gently. "From this day, no alchemy shall be practiced within these walls. Let wisdom walk beside caution." The students obeyed, yet the dream of transformation never fully died, and sometimes, in the deepest hours of study, when the candle gutters low, it's said that a faint spark still flickers in the air, quiet, curious, and kind, reminding all who seek knowledge that light and fire are born of the same flame. In the soft dusk of Norwich, where narrow streets wound between candlelit inns, there lived a poet named Thomas, young, clever, and a little too bold for the quiet age he lived in. His songs filled taverns and courtyards alike, weaving laughter into the smoky air. People loved him for his wit, for the way his words could lift the weariness from a long day. Yet one evening, carried by mirth and melody, he strayed too far. Before a crowd warmed by wine, Thomas sang of the king, not cruelly, but carelessly. His tune danced upon the line between humour and defiance, and though the people laughed, the sound carried beyond the gates. Within a fortnight, word reached the palace. The laughter that had once crowned him turned to hush. A decree followed swiftly. No bard would again mock the crown, nor twist song into weapon. Thomas vanished from the squares, but his verses lingered like perfume after a festival. Other poets sang more softly now, their words brushed with care and reverence. Yet something in his spirit endured, a reminder that art must walk between truth and tenderness. Years later, a traveller paused beneath the old tavern window and thought he heard a faint melody drifting through the dark. It was gentle, wistful, almost apologetic. Perhaps it was only the wind, but perhaps it was Thomas, still singing, teaching the world that even the freest song must bow just a little before the weight of its own words. The Women of Sparta, Strength in Stillness. In the dawn light over the Peloponnesian hills, the city of Sparta awakened not with noise, but with rhythm, measured, deliberate, like a heartbeat beneath stone. The wind swept softly through olive trees, carrying with it the scent of earth and sea. Within the high walls of the city, life began early, for in Sparta every morning was a lesson, and every lesson a preparation for strength. In that ancient world, the first cry of a newborn was not only the sound of life, but of judgment. The elders would gather to look upon the child, its small hands, its breath, its pulse. Weakness was pitied, but not preserved. Only the strong, whether boy or girl, were chosen to remain beneath the Spartan sun. For the city believed that endurance, not comfort, was the truest form of love. To them, strength was not cruelty, it was devotion to the survival of all. And so the girls who remained grew up in the open air. They ran beside the Eurotas River, their laughter mingling with the rush of water. They learned to throw the javelin, to wrestle, to sing hymns to Artemis with voices as clear as mountain streams. Their bodies were taught to bend and not break, to breathe through pain, to move with the same steadiness as the warriors they would one day raise. The training was not punishment, it was preparation, a song of discipline disguised as play. Their mothers watched from the courtyards, weaving and teaching in silence. They did not praise beauty as other cities did. They praised endurance, the calm that followed effort, the quiet pride of standing tall beneath the sun. From childhood, every Spartan girl knew that her worth was not in ornament, but in spirit. She was the daughter of a land that measured love in courage. When evening came, the city slowed. The same girls who had run through the fields gathered around small fires to listen to stories of Leonidas and his warriors, men who stood against empires, who did not fear death but dishonor. They listened not with fear but with quiet admiration, learning that bravery had many shapes. Some wore armor, others wore patience, some wielded swords, others carried children. All were part of the same unbroken line of strength. As the moon rose, the wind softened again, tracing silver across the rooftops. The elders spoke of balance, that power without mercy is brittle, and that true strength must carry gentleness within it. The young girls closed their eyes, feeling the warmth of the fire fade into the cool of night. Tomorrow they would rise again to train, to learn, to grow steady as the earth beneath their feet. And so it was that Sparta's daughters came to mirror their city, unyielding, silent, and eternal. Their strength began not in conquest, but in calm, not in the roar of battle, but in the stillness before it. Beneath the endless sky, they learned the first lesson of their lives, that silence, when born of courage, is never weakness at all. Morning in Sparta began not with words, but with motion. Before the sun had fully risen, the fields beyond the city shimmered with dew, and the air carried the mingled scents of salt from the distant sea and wild thyme from the hills. Across the plain, the voices of young women rose in unison, steady, rhythmic, confident. Barefoot, they ran along the river's edge, their steps light upon the earth, their breath aligned like the beat of a single heart. The world around them seemed to breathe with them. Even the wind paused to listen. Their teachers stood watchful, neither harsh nor indulgent. In Sparta, training was not punishment, it was the poetry of the body made visible. The girls learned to run, not to flee, but to endure. To lift, not to conquer, but to become whole. Their limbs moved like the lines of a hymn, graceful, unbroken, filled with quiet purpose. When they tired, they did not stop. They slowed, found their breath, and continued, for persistence was the first lesson of strength. Beyond the fields, the sound of metal rang out as others practiced the discus, each throw cutting a clean arc through the morning air. The sun flashed across bronze as the disc spun, landing with soft thuds into the sand. The girls laughed, not with pride, but with delight in the harmony of motion. Strength here was not loud, it was serene, controlled, a balance between power and peace. After training, the wrestling ground awaited, a circle of earth packed firm and smooth. Pairs of students met there, their movements fluid, deliberate, almost ceremonial. They learned the art of balance, to fall without fear, to rise without anger. Around them, older women watched in silence, their eyes reflecting the same calm discipline that had guided generations before. The lessons of the body were also lessons of the mind, how to yield without breaking, how to act without cruelty. When the morning heat began to soften, they gathered near the olive groves and sang. The melodies carried through the valley, mingling with the whisper of waves from the distant coast. Their songs praised Artemis, guardian of the young, and echoed with gratitude for the strength of their own bodies. Each voice blended into the next, forming a single note of harmony that seemed to stretch into the sky. It was said that even the soldiers on the training fields paused to listen, reminded that courage and beauty were born of the same breath. By noon, the city glowed beneath the sun, the girls walking homeward in quiet pride. Their muscles ached, but pleasantly, like strings pulled taut and tuned. The discipline of the morning had left its mark not in sweat alone, but in spirit. For Sparta believed that a mind could not be strong if the body was neglected, and that true grace lived in the union of both. And as the sea wind swept gently across the plain, the songs of the morning lingered, soft, steady, eternal, like the heartbeat of Sparta itself. The sun climbed slowly over the hills of Sparta, casting long gold ribbons across the courtyards where young women sat in small circles, their backs straight, their faces calm. The morning training was done. The air still smelled faintly of sweat and olive oil. Now came another discipline, one quieter but no less demanding. They would learn not to fight with arms, but with thought. Their teachers spoke in voices that flowed like rivers, measured, deliberate, never hurried. "To command others," said one, "you must first command yourself." The girls listened, their minds alert, their hands resting still upon their knees. They studied logic, philosophy, and the art of speech, not to decorate their words, but to give them weight. They learned when to speak, and when silence was stronger than sound. In Sparta, a woman's tongue could shape a man's courage. Mothers were known to scorn cowardice and to praise restraint. A few words, spoken without tremor, could lift an army or shame it. To teach that balance, their tutors would pose riddles and questions. "What is the hardest victory?" one would ask. And the answer, always whispered, was the one over oneself. At midday, the girls walked to the shaded gardens behind the Temple of Athena, where they practiced debate among the olive trees. Their voices carried softly over the grass, blending reason with grace. They were not taught to please, but to persuade, to think as clearly as they moved. Wisdom was a kind of endurance, and they wore it as silently as armor. Sometimes, when the lessons ended, an older woman would recite sayings of the queens who came before them. Gorgo, wife of Leonidas, who once said, "Only Spartan women give birth to real men." The words were not prideful, they were an invocation of duty, the quiet certainty that virtue could dwell in strength. In the evenings when the fires were lit, the students would write what they had learned upon wax tablets, lines of philosophy, fragments of poetry, small truths polished smooth by repetition. And when the lamps were extinguished, they would sit together in the darkness, feeling the stillness settle inside them like water finding its level. For Sparta believed that the mind must be trained as carefully as the body, that wisdom without patience was as dangerous as a sword without balance. These young women were taught to see beyond anger, beyond impulse, to the calm that holds all power. As night deepened, the city rested beneath the hush of distant waves. Somewhere the faint sound of chanting drifted from the barracks, a reminder of the warriors they would one day guide. But here, in the quiet of study and reflection, the true foundation of Sparta was being built, not in stone, nor in steel, but in thought. And in that stillness where words met silence and strength met gentleness, the daughters of Sparta learned the oldest lesson of all, that endurance is not only to bear, but to understand. Evening settled gently over Sparta, the last rays of the sun spilling like molten bronze across the rooftops. From the mountains came the slow cry of wind, cool and unending, carrying with it the echo of the day's training and the hum of quiet life returning home. In this city of warriors, where every breath was shaped by discipline, marriage was not a romance sung by poets. It was an alliance between strength and purpose. A Spartan girl did not marry for wealth or comfort. Her worth was already known. Her dowry was her courage. When she came of age, she had run faster than many men, had wrestled beneath the same sun, and had learned to speak with the same composure as her elders. And so her wedding was not a ceremony of ornament, but of solemn joy. The women wove her cloak in silence, each thread carrying a blessing of endurance. The men stood watch as the torches were lit, their flames steady, as if guarded by the very air. The bride and groom would meet not as strangers, but as equals in a shared calling. He was to defend Sparta, she was to preserve it. He carried the spear, she the hearth. Together they formed the two halves of one duty, to ensure that the city's heart never faltered. There was no vow of submission, no promise of gentle words. Instead, they pledged respect, loyalty, and the quiet strength of shared endurance. It was said that Spartan women did not follow their husbands to war, nor weep when they marched away. Instead, they stood at the city gates, the wind lifting their cloaks, eyes fixed upon the line of shields gleaming in the sun. One mother would hand her son his armor and whisper the words that would pass through generations. "With your shield, or on it." The phrase was not cruelty, but faith, the belief that honor outweighed survival, that a life without courage was not truly lived. When the soldiers returned, whether in triumph or in silence, the women met them with the same calm dignity. Those who had fallen were mourned not with tears, but with garlands and song. The widows carried themselves with unshaken composure, for in Sparta, grief was not a wound, but a mantle, a proof that one had loved someone worthy of remembrance. Even in marriage, a woman's strength was measured by her steadiness. She ruled her household with the same discipline her husband ruled his soldiers. She taught her daughters that love was not weakness, and her sons that bravery was born from their mother's heart. Within the quiet courtyards of stone, she became the center around which all life revolved, the keeper of laws unwritten, the guardian of courage. As night fell and the fires dimmed, the women of Sparta would stand at their doorways, listening to the sea. They did not pray for safety, they prayed for resolve. The stars above them, clear and countless, shone on both battlefield and home alike. And in that shared light, love and duty became one. For Sparta believed that true affection was not fragile, but forged in endurance. Theirs was a love that did not ask to be spoken, because it was already lived, in the discipline of dawn, in the silence of waiting, and in the simple, steadfast promise that courage would always return home. When the men of Sparta marched to war, the city did not fall quiet. It changed its rhythm. The echo of shields faded into the mountains, and what remained was a different kind of strength, one that spoke not in shouts, but in silence. The women stepped forward without ceremony, their faces calm beneath the weight of duty. No one had to tell them what to do. They had learned long ago that leadership, when born from necessity, needs no announcement. Each morning, as the first light touched the rooftops, they opened the doors to their courtyards. The air smelled of olive oil, wool, and sea wind. From one end of the city to the other, they oversaw the estates, the harvest, the work of artisans. They kept the books, counted the grain, and measured the yield of vineyards. Their hands, once trained for balance and grace, now measured and built. They were mothers, wives, and guardians of a kingdom held together by discipline. In their quiet rule, there was harmony. They did not command with voices raised, but with steady eyes and gestures. Servants, merchants, and children moved to their rhythm, finding comfort in their constancy. The women of Sparta knew that to panic was to lose control, and to despair was to dishonor the absent. Their calm became the pulse of the city, an invisible order, stronger than any army's shield wall. At dusk they gathered in small groups by the temples, lighting lamps in shallow bronze bowls. Their prayers were not of fear, nor pleas for mercy. They prayed instead for balance, for the courage of their men to be matched by wisdom at home. When news from the battlefield was scarce, they kept faith through work, Through the endless cycles of tending and preparing, their patience a fortress no flame could breach. Children grew beneath their watchful eyes, learning that silence was not emptiness but space for thought. Boys learned discipline in their mother's presence before they ever held a sword. Girls learned dignity before they ever spoke in public. The city breathed through them, its stillness alive with purpose. Sometimes, in the deep of night, the wind carried faint echoes from the plains, the distant thud of marching feet or the hum of campfire songs. The women would pause their weaving, listening, their hands still. In those moments, they were not only wives or mothers, but the soul of Sparta itself, holding the line between life and loss, between waiting and faith. When the warriors finally returned, the city did not erupt in celebration. There were no parades, no trumpets, only embraces that spoke of endurance rather than relief. The women met them with the same composure they had kept through every season apart. Their silence had preserved the order of home, and that quiet became a mirror in which every soldier saw the reason he had fought. Thus the power of Sparta was not forged only in iron or fire. It lived in the stillness of its women, their calm hands, their steady breath, their unbroken faith. In their silence lay the strength that words could not carry, the balance that held the city together while the world beyond trembled. And when the night returned and the moon hung over the sleeping rooftops, their silence once more filled the air, not empty, not lonely, but full of meaning, like the pause between heartbeats that keeps all life in rhythm. Long after the glory of Sparta had faded into the folds of history, when its marble walls had crumbled and the songs of its warriors were but distant echoes, the memory of its women endured. The world around them had changed, empires rose and fell, languages shifted like sand, but the image of the Spartan woman remained, clear as a carving untouched by time. She stood not upon the battlefield, but within the memory of the human spirit, still, strong, and radiant in her quiet pride. Travelers who passed through the ruins of Laconia centuries later spoke of an unusual calm that lingered there. The wind moved gently over the stones, and they said it carried whispers of discipline, the ghost of order. The olive trees still grew in neat lines, as though the women who once tended them had never left. In that stillness, the essence of Sparta survived, unwritten, unspoken, but alive. Historians remembered the men, Leonidas and his 300, the warriors who stood against the East. Yet the poets, those who listened between silences, wrote of the women. They wrote of mothers who taught courage before birth, of wives who ruled without titles, of daughters who learned to walk with straight spines and steady hearts. They called them the living pillars of Sparta, the invisible hands that held the city upright, even as its spears fell silent. In other lands where women were kept behind veils or bound by custom, the tales of Sparta brought both wonder and unease. How could a city entrust so much strength to its women? Yet that was its secret, the balance between power and restraint, between sound and silence. The Spartan woman did not shout her worth, she embodied it. Her dignity was not granted by men or law, but earned through endurance. She proved that control, once internal, could command the world without force. As centuries turned, philosophers found in her a symbol of balance, the harmony of mind, body, and will. To them she represented the meeting of opposites, grace and discipline, pride and humility, speech and silence. Even when Sparta was no more than a line in a scholar's text, her presence lived in ideals that shaped the world to come. The Stoic philosophers would later speak of self-mastery and calm in adversity, but the women of Sparta had already lived it quietly long before words gave it name. In art and legend, she was reborn. Sculptors carved her likeness not as a goddess, but as a mortal touched by constancy, her gaze forward, her mouth unbowed. Painters caught her in moments of repose, hands folded upon her lap, her strength resting beneath serenity. And in those portrayals one could almost hear the echo of her voice, steady, low, and sure, as if she were still teaching the world to hold its breath before speaking. But perhaps her truest legacy was not in art or philosophy, but in the unseen inheritance passed from mother to daughter through centuries of quiet strength. Wherever a woman stood unafraid to think, to lead, to endure without applause, a shadow of Sparta flickered within her. She was not remembered in monuments or crowns, but in posture, in patience, in the calm refusal to yield to despair. As night falls over the imagined ruins of the city, the moon rises once more above the Taygetus mountains. The stones gleam pale as bone, the river murmurs softly below, and the air seems to hum with remembrance. In that endless hush, you might almost see her walking there, barefoot, ageless, her eyes clear as the morning she was born into. She pauses, lifts her face to the wind, and for a heartbeat, the world feels whole again. Sparta has long vanished, but her daughters remain, in every quiet act of courage, in every graceful gesture of resolve, in every life lived with purpose instead of pride. Their legacy is not carved in marble, it is whispered in every moment of composure, every breath that holds rather than breaks. And so the story ends as it began, with silence. A silence not of emptiness, but of peace. The kind that hums softly through the centuries, reminding all who listen that dignity, once awakened, never truly sleeps. The Ottoman Harem, power behind the veil. In the quiet dawn that brushed the domes of Topkapi Palace with gold, the sound of distant fountains whispered through marble courtyards. The city of Istanbul stirred beyond the palace walls, merchants calling, gulls crying above the Bosphorus, but within the inner chambers a softer world awakened. It was the world of the harem, where time moved like the slow unfolding of silk, and every breath was measured, deliberate, composed. Here lived the odalisks, the learners of grace. They were young women brought from distant lands, from mountains and islands and river valleys far away. Some remembered the scent of pine forests, others the salt of the Black Sea. When they first arrived, fear followed them like a shadow. The palace was vast, its corridors endless, its language strange. But within the stillness of its walls they were not forgotten. They were shaped. From the first morning they were taught that beauty was not ornament, but discipline. Their teachers, older women, draped in soft veils, guided them with patient hands. They learned how to walk so quietly that even the echo of their steps became a melody. They learned music, the gentle curve of the oud string beneath their fingers, the rise and fall of their voices in the morning hymns. They learned to speak Turkish, Arabic, Persian, each word pronounced like a petal opening. Every lesson was an act of devotion, how to serve tea without sound, how to bow without bending the spirit, how to listen without interruption. They studied the calligraphy of poets, tracing verses of Rumi, until their hands understood the rhythm of meaning. In the gardens they learned the care of flowers, the language of fragrance, the patience of waiting for a bud to bloom. Even silence, they discovered, was a form of eloquence. At twilight, when the sun sank behind the domes, the odalisks gathered in the practice hall. Candles burned low, the air thick with jasmine. They danced, not to impress, but to remember the grace of movement itself. Each gesture, each turn of the wrist was a whisper of composure. There was no audience, only reflection, the kind that blooms in still water. The palace did not ask them to forget who they were. It asked them to transform. Slowly the fear that had followed them began to fade. In its place grew poise, understanding, and a quiet pride. They were no longer merely servants, they were students of presence, apprentices in the art of serenity. When the Sultan passed through the outer gardens, they did not look directly at him, but their stillness spoke louder than words. For in the harem, power was not in speech or command, it lived in calm, in self-control, in the invisible strength of grace. And so, as the night deepened over the Bosphorus and the stars shimmered like silver dust upon the water, the odalisks lay down to rest. The scent of rosewater lingered in their hair, the echoes of their lessons still soft upon their breath. They had learned the first rule of the harem, the one never written but always felt, that true beauty is the art of stillness, and that stillness, once mastered, can hold the world in its hands. In the heart of the palace, behind doors carved with verses and vines, stretched a world of order hidden beneath silk and perfume. The harem was not chaos, as foreign tongues once claimed. It was a kingdom within a kingdom, ruled by quiet ambition and the slow, graceful ascent of patience. Every corridor, every curtained archway held its own law, every whisper carried meaning. At the base of this ladder were the odalisks, the learners of grace. They moved like shadows through the marble halls, their eyes lowered, their hands folded. Their duty was to observe, to perfect the art of silence and service. From them, a few, those whose calm concealed brilliance, rose higher, chosen to serve nearer to the heart of power. These became the concubines, women trained in every refinement of manner and mind. They knew poetry, conversation, and the delicate balance of deference and wit. Each was a mirror, reflecting not only beauty, but understanding. They attended the Sultan's private gatherings, their presence an ornament of serenity. Yet even here, every gesture was measured. One misstep, one careless glance could close a door forever. Above them stood the Guzda, the favorites. To reach that rank was to be noticed, not loudly, but through the quiet magnetism of composure. A favorite was not chosen for her face alone, but for her stillness, for the way she could listen longer than others could speak. Her smile was diplomacy, her silence, persuasion. She learned the language of waiting, the art of allowing fortune to find her instead of chasing it. Beyond the favorites were the cadens, the consorts, women who had borne the Sultan's sons. Their chambers looked out upon the inner gardens where fountains sang day and night. They held both tenderness and caution, for motherhood within the harem was not only joy, it was strategy. The birth of a child could change the course of the empire. And so these women moved carefully through a world of glances and secrets, where power breathed softly behind veils. At the summit of this living hierarchy stood one figure above all others, the Haseki Sultan, the chosen consort, beloved and trusted. Her voice could alter decrees, her letters could shift the tides of policy. Yet even she was bound by the unspoken laws of grace. For in this empire of restraint, the truest authority was never shouted. It was woven, like silk, through patience, wisdom, and composure. From odalisk to Haseki, the ladder was climbed not by defiance, but by understanding, by learning when to move and when to be still. Every woman knew that power gained too quickly was fragile, like glass before the kiln. Real strength was tempered in time, forged in silence, polished by the hand of humility. And when the moonlight spilled across the palace floors at night, it touched every rank the same, the learners, the favorites, the mothers, the queen. For in that soft silver light, all their stories became one, a quiet testament to endurance, to intellect, and to the slow, graceful rhythm of power earned through peace. In the quiet corridors of Topkapi, where lamplight flickered on mosaics of blue and gold, there once walked a woman whose smile could bend the will of kings. Her name was Hurrem Sultan, though once, long ago, she had been called Roxolana, the girl from the cold lands beyond the Black Sea. She arrived not in splendor, but in chains, her heart wrapped in memory and silence. Yet from that silence she would rise, not through beauty alone, but through the calm, luminous power of thought. They said her laughter was unlike any other. It came softly, like wind through jasmine, and it carried something rare in the harem: warmth. Where others wore caution as armor, Hurrem carried understanding. She listened, observed, and learned the rhythm of the palace, the way words moved faster than footsteps, how a smile could travel farther than a decree. In time, she caught the eye of Sultan Suleiman, not because she sought to be seen, but because she saw him, beyond the crown, beyond the burden. When she spoke, her words were deliberate, smooth as ink drawn from a quill. She spoke not of conquest, but of peace, not of wealth, but of wisdom. The Sultan listened, and for the first time he found not flattery, but counsel. Hurrem became his confidant, his mirror of thought. Their letters, still preserved in faded script, reveal a gentleness that transcended courtly ceremony. She wrote of love not as a flame, but as a light, steady, guiding, calm. "Your heart," she once wrote, "is my homeland, and in that land I am free." Her words wove a bond stronger than any chain of gold, a bond born of respect and intellect. As Hurrem rose to become Haseki Sultan, the favored consort, the court trembled with both admiration and envy. Yet she met intrigue with grace, never haste. Where others schemed in shadows, she worked in light, building schools, baths, and kitchens for the poor. Her influence extended beyond the harem's walls, yet she moved as if weightless, her gestures measured, her tone serene. Power to her was not thunder, it was the steady drift of the tide. Even in moments of danger, when whispers circled like falcons above her name, she remained still. She knew that fear was the enemy of wisdom, and silence its most faithful companion. In the reflection of her calm, others revealed themselves, and in that understanding lay her mastery. In her later years, when the fires of youth had cooled, she would often stand upon the terrace overlooking the Bosphorus. The water shimmered below her, endless and calm, like the life she had carved from captivity. She had begun as a slave and ended as a queen, not by defiance, but by clarity. And when the call to prayer rose from the minarets and drifted through the evening air, her name lingered in the hush that followed: Hurrem, the smiling one, whose mind ruled where armies could not. In the highest chambers of the palace, where the air was cool and the lamps burned low, lived the woman who ruled without needing to be seen. She was the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, the heart behind the throne, the quiet architect of the empire's pulse. Her title meant validity, the root from which the realm drew balance. And indeed, she was balance itself, wisdom and stillness, love and law entwined like silk threads in her hand. Her world was made of whispers. Courtiers bowed when she passed. Eunuchs stepped aside in perfect silence, and the marble floors gleamed with reflections of her calm. She did not command armies or hold the seal of the state, yet her word could move the tides of fate. Ministers hesitated before speaking in her presence, for they knew that behind her gaze lay not emotion, but comprehension. Each morning she received the reports of the harem and the empire alike, letters, ledgers, the soft murmur of secrets carried by loyal hands. Her desk was always immaculate, her calligraphy as steady as the rhythm of her breath. She weighed every matter with patience, for haste, she believed, was the language of those who did not yet understand power. The Valid Sultan had seen more than most. She had once been a concubine, then a mother, then a widow of silence. Through loss and endurance, she had learned the art of ruling hearts as much as lands. When her son rose to the throne, she did not rejoice with pride. She watched with caution, for she knew that crowns weigh heavy upon young heads. It was her task to steady him, to counsel, to protect, and when needed, to correct. In the evenings, she walked through the inner gardens, where peacocks dozed beneath the fig trees and the scent of roses hung heavy in the air. Servants followed a few steps behind, carrying lamps whose flames flickered in the wind. There, among the marble fountains, she found her truest peace. The sound of water reminded her of the years gone by, the laughter of her son as a child, the tears she never shed in public, the prayers whispered into the folds of the night. To the women of the harem, she was both teacher and guardian. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words carried the weight of a generation. Beauty fades, she would tell them softly, but composure endures. Remember this, and you will never be powerless. Many feared her, yet more revered her. For in her quiet, they sensed protection. In her discipline, they found safety. When her health waned and her steps grew slow, the empire itself seemed to pause. Courtiers and concubines alike felt the stillness change. The Valid Sultan had become more than a person. She was an idea, a breath of wisdom woven into the empire's soul. And so, when her final night came and the palace lamps dimmed in her honor, the silence that followed was not of sorrow, but of awe. For in her life she had proven what only few understand, that true power does not roar, it whispers, and the world listens. The evening light over the Bosphorus softened into gold, then deepened into violet. The domes of Topkapi glowed faintly beneath the fading sun, their reflections trembling across the still water. The empire that once stretched from desert to sea now exhaled, slow and long, as though the centuries themselves had grown tired. The songs of victory had fallen silent. The footsteps of envoys once echoing through the courtyards had faded to memory. Only the wind remained, moving gently through the latticed windows of the harem, carrying the scent of cedar and rose from the gardens below. The women of the harem still walked those corridors, but their world had changed. The age of whispers and intrigue had softened into ritual, ceremony, and remembrance. They no longer shaped empires with letters and counsel. Instead, they tended to the past, preserving it with grace. The mirrors that once reflected ambition now held the faces of dreamers, girls reading poetry by candlelight, tracing the names of those who had come before them, Kösem, Turhan, Hürrem. In the stillness of the palace, their ghosts lingered, not haunting, but watching. The great apartments were quieter now, the fountains slower, their songs almost shy. Yet in every echo of dripping water, in every flutter of curtain, something of their spirit endured, the discipline of silence, the elegance of patience, the calm intelligence that had once steered empires from behind closed doors. Outside, Istanbul continued to breathe, the call to prayer rising and falling like the tide. Ships crossed the narrow strait beneath the fading sky, their sails dim ghosts against the light. Within the palace walls, the world of the harem became a memory wrapped in perfume and time. The eunuchs still lit the lamps at dusk, their reflections winking like stars along the marble floor, but fewer voices sang now. The empire no longer listened for its women's counsel. It had grown proud and then, inevitably, quiet. And yet, their legacy did not vanish. It lived on in the rhythm of the city itself, in the patience of its markets, the softness of its speech, the steadiness of its women. It lived in the stories whispered by grandmothers to daughters of women who ruled without crowns, who spoke with restraint but thought with brilliance. The empire had dimmed, but its wisdom had scattered like light upon the sea. At night, when the palace slept, the moon would glide over the rooftops, turning the stone to silver. The Bosphorus shimmered like a sheet of glass, and for a moment, time held its breath. Somewhere, deep within the harem's quiet heart, a door would creak, and the faint scent of rosewater would drift through the air. Perhaps it was only the wind, or perhaps the past, exhaling softly, reminding the living that even when power fades, grace endures. And so the empire rested, not in ruin, but in repose. Its women, once hidden, now belonged to eternity, voices without sound, power without boundary, and silence that would outlast every dynasty. Marco Polo, the storyteller of the world. In the soft blue hour before dawn, Venice seemed to float between worlds. The sea and sky were the same color, a quiet silver that shimmered against the walls of the sleeping city. Lanterns swayed on wooden docks, their reflections trembling across the canals like scattered stars. Somewhere among them, a boy named Marco Polo stood beside his father's ship, breathing in the salt, the wind, and the faint, endless promise of elsewhere. He was not yet the traveler the world would remember. He was simply curious, a child who loved maps without borders, who traced his fingers across the edges of parchment and wondered what lay beyond the painted seas. His father and uncle were merchants, men who returned from distant lands carrying silks, spices, and stories. To Marco, those stories mattered more than the treasures. He listened by the fire at night as they spoke of deserts that glowed like gold and mountains sharp as glass. The words lingered in his mind, glowing long after the lamps were dimmed. Venice itself was a classroom of wonder. Ships from every corner of the world filled its harbors, Greek, Arab, Persian, Mongol. The air smelled of salt and cinnamon, of things carried across oceans. Marco learned to read not only letters but gestures, accents, silences. He learned that knowledge was the truest kind of wealth, and that the horizon was never an ending, only an invitation. Some nights, when the tide was low and the city was hushed, he would climb to the roof and look out toward the dark line of the sea. The water seemed to whisper his name, as if calling him toward the places yet unseen. He did not know it then, but the journey that would change the world had already begun, not with a map or a ship, but with a question that would not let him sleep. And as the first light touched the domes and bell towers, he closed his eyes and dreamed of roads untraveled, of languages unspoken, of stars that guided men toward the edges of the earth. Venice woke around him, but Marco was already elsewhere, in that secret space between curiosity and destiny, where every great adventure is born. The morning he left Venice, the sea was calm as glass. The sails rose slowly, gathering the wind like breath, and Marco stood beside his father and uncle, watching the city fade into mist. Bells echoed faintly from distant towers, and for a long moment he felt both the weight of leaving and the lightness of beginning. Ahead lay the unknown. Deserts, mountains, and empires whispered about in markets and dreams. The journey unfolded not in haste, but in quiet endurance. Across the Mediterranean and into the lands of Persia, Marco learned the rhythm of travel, the steady pace of camels through sand, the shifting color of dawn over endless plains. He learned how silence could stretch for miles, and how stars became companions when all else was darkness. Nights were spent beneath the sky's unbroken dome, the air cool and filled with the scent of dust and smoke. The fire crackled softly and stories replaced sleep. His uncle spoke of cities that glimmered like jewels. His father murmured prayers to keep the road kind. They crossed the mountains of the Pamirs, where the air thinned and every breath was a gift. Snow glittered under a pale sun, and the silence there was absolute. In that stillness, Marco understood something sacred, the vastness of the world and how small one must become to truly see it. He carried that lesson with him as they descended into the wide plains of Central Asia, where the air was thick with life again. Horses, traders, tents glowing like amber in the twilight. In the oases they met people of many tongues. Marco listened more than he spoke, gathering words the way a collector gathers rare stones. He watched how faces changed with laughter, how kindness could cross every language. The road taught him patience, and the road gave him awe. By the time they reached the great walls of the east, months had blurred into memory. His boots were worn, his skin bronzed by wind, but his eyes were alight with wonder. The world had opened before him like a book with no end, and he was ready to read every page. That night, as campfires flickered beneath the stars, he lay awake, listening to the quiet heartbeat of the earth. The journey had only begun, but already it had changed the way he dreamed. Beyond the desert winds and the frozen passes, where mountains folded into mist and rivers turned the color of jade, Marco Polo entered a world unlike any he had known. The court of Kublai Khan rose before him, a vast city of marble and silk, where the air itself seemed to shimmer with order and purpose. Golden roofs gleamed beneath a sky so wide it seemed to hold eternity, and the scent of sandalwood drifted through courtyards carved with dragons and flowers. Here, time moved differently. The Khan's palace stretched like a dream, its halls lined with guards whose armor caught the light like rippling water. When Marco was first brought before the great Khan, he bowed low, but the ruler's eyes, clear, calm, and sharp as a blade, saw him as more than a traveler. In that moment, the Venetian boy became a bridge between worlds. Kublai Khan spoke softly, his words measured like the ticking of a clock. He asked of the West, its kings, its faiths, its cities by the sea. Marco answered carefully, his voice steady, but filled with wonder. And so began their strange friendship. An emperor who ruled through wisdom and a young man who ruled through curiosity. Days passed into months, months into years. Marco walked the markets of Cathay, where traders from every land gathered, where paper money changed hands and porcelain gleamed like captured moonlight. He studied the roads that stretched across the empire, watched engineers carve canals that fed entire cities, and marveled at the order of it all. At night, he dined in the palace gardens, where the air shimmered with the sound of distant zithers and the soft splash of fountains. Lanterns hung from every tree, glowing like captive stars. The Khan often joined him, not as a monarch, but as a mind-seeking reflection. Together they spoke of the world as if it were a single, breathing being, vast, mysterious, alive. And though Marco's heart sometimes ached for Venice, for the sea and the bells and the scent of salt, he knew he had found another home here, in a place where learning was power, where silence meant respect, and where his words could carry across empires. Under the pale light of a Mongolian moon, he understood at last. He was no longer merely a traveler. He was a witness to the shape of the world. Years passed, and the winds that had once carried Marco Polo across empires finally brought him home. Venice, the city of his birth, waited with the sound of bells and the smell of salt and stone. Yet when he walked its narrow streets again, he felt the quiet distance between who he had been and who he had become. The sea was the same, but he was changed. His eyes had seen too much to rest easily upon the familiar. War found him soon after his return. Captured in battle and locked away in a Genoese prison, Marco found himself enclosed again by walls. But this time they could not contain the world within him. In the flickering half-light of his cell, he met a fellow captive, Rusticello, a writer of romances and tales. Marco began to speak, not to boast, but to remember, to weave his memories into something lasting, something that would not fade like a footprint in the sand. Night after night, he spoke of deserts that glowed like embers, of golden cities reflected in still waters, of rulers who governed with thought instead of fear. He described temples, feasts, markets, and the endless sky of Asia. Rusticello listened, his pen moving in rhythm with the words, and together they built a map made of sentences. The cell became a world. The sound of chains turned into the rustle of silk. The air smelled not of damp stone, but of myrrh and spice. Even the guards paused sometimes, leaning close to hear stories of lands they could never imagine. When the travels of Marco Polo was finished, it was not just a book, it was a bridge. Through his words, the East and West met for the first time in shared wonder. Kings, scholars, and sailors read his tales and dreamed of distant horizons. Some doubted him, some called him a liar, but none could stop the pull of the world he had painted. Years later, as an old man, Marco was asked if his stories were true. He smiled, his eyes reflecting the calm of one who had seen beyond disbelief. "I have not told half of what I saw," he said softly. And when he slept that night, he dreamed again of the road, the same road that began in Venice and stretched endlessly toward the rising sun. In his final years, Marco Polo lived quietly by the canals of Venice, the same waters that had once carried him toward the unknown. The city had grown older, and so had he. Yet sometimes, when the fog drifted low over the lagoon, he would imagine the shapes of distant lands in its folds, palaces of jade, the dunes of Persia, the cold brightness of the Mongol plains. The world had never truly left him. It lingered behind his eyes, endless and alive. His book, The Travels of Marco Polo, had begun as a tale told in a cell, but it had become something greater, a key that unlocked the dreams of generations. Sailors read it by lantern light, tracing his roots with trembling fingers. Scholars debated its truths and secrets. Artists painted what his words described. Silk cities, golden towers, emperors beneath banners that caught the sun. Some called it legend, others revelation. But all who opened its pages felt a stirring, a quiet voice whispering that the world was wider than they had known. In time, his stories reached men who would set sail themselves, Columbus, Magellan, explorers who carried maps inked with Marco's memory. The world began to move again, guided not by fear, but by curiosity. The bridges between East and West grew stronger, built on the fragile foundation of a story told long ago. At night, in his home overlooking the water, Marco would sit by the window as the tide sighed against the stones. The moon shimmered on the canal, and the city glowed softly, as if listening. Perhaps he knew, or perhaps he only hoped, that stories live longer than kingdoms, longer than empires. That a single voice, spoken in wonder, can travel farther than any ship. When he closed his eyes for the last time, Venice was quiet. A candle flickered beside him, and its light trembled like the edge of dawn. It was the same light that had guided his journey, the glow of curiosity, of faith in the unseen, of longing for the horizon. And as that flame stilled, the world kept turning, full of travelers who followed his light, each carrying a spark of the storyteller who once dreamed the earth awake. The long breath of history. And so as the pages close, the voices of time grow soft again. From the clatter of armor in medieval courtyards, to the quiet strength of Spartan women, to the veiled wisdom of the Ottoman Harem, and finally to the gentle wake of Marco Polo's ship disappearing into mist. History exhales, calm and full. It is not a shout, but a sigh, long and tender, as though the world itself were drifting into sleep. Every tale has carried its own light. Some flickered with laughter born from foolishness and pride, others glowed steady, shaped by courage and grace. Each story, in its own way, has been a lesson whispered through centuries that the human heart is both fragile and fierce, that even in error we are learning the language of understanding. The monk who feared his reflection, the queen who ruled through silence, the scribe who dreamed of distant lands, all are bound by one quiet thread, the desire to be seen, to be understood, to leave something behind that speaks of who we were. History, when told gently, becomes not a record of triumph or loss, but a lullaby of connection, a reminder that we are never truly apart from those who came before us. Outside, the night deepens. The stars shimmer like old stories scattered across the sky, patient and eternal. Somewhere, perhaps in another age, another voice will rise to tell them again. And in that retelling, the world will breathe once more, slowly, peacefully, beautifully, just as it always has.